All right, welcome to week 8 of Advanced Language Arts. This is when we're going to kind of diverge away from kind of standard LA8 material and focus on some things that we're supposed to be focusing on had we still been in school that will help you prepare for that pre-assessment if you're choosing to sit for high school credit options. Again, none of this work is required. It is just there to help you be a little bit more successful on some sections where we feel like we've hit the standards, but they were a while ago, so we're going to come back and review them. Or they're newer things that we haven't talked about. One of those newer things is older language, and some of those kind of standard older historical texts in language arts studies that we did not get to, which is where we would normally be studying Romeo and Juliet and the Odyssey. So we are going to move forward with Romeo and Juliet. That should get you plenty prepared for the pre-assessment in the first week of June. So this lesson today is a little bit more of an intro to the life of Shakespeare's England and some of the language that we're going to be seeing in Shakespearean text. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the verse of Shakespeare, as well as looking at a couple of his sonnets that go into your weekly assignment work for this week. And then Wednesday, we're going to start getting into the text of Romeo and Juliet itself, specifically looking at the kind of introductory piece of the prologue. All right, so when we're talking about Shakespearean England, we're talking about a time of the Renaissance. So this is the 15th and 16th centuries primarily. There were a little bit before and a little bit after, but this is kind of the meat and potatoes of the Renaissance period. So the 15th century would be the 1400s, and then the 16th century would be the 1500s. Queen Elizabeth is reigning during this time. It's lots of times called, if you're talking specifically about England, you're talking about the Elizabethan age, because Queen Elizabeth is the first. Actually, I don't think she is the first queen to sit on the throne. I think she's the first queen to sit solely on the throne. She never married throughout her life, and I think this is England's first female ruler who did not have kind of a man in charge at this point. Her dad was major drama. Her dad was originally married, so King Henry VIII was originally married to Catherine of Aragon, and unfortunately, they were not able to have a son. And in these days, it was like the ultimate importance that when you got married, you had a son to carry on your family's lineage, to carry on your name, and if you were family in power, to carry on that power. It was not a time where queens really ruled by themselves, which is why Elizabeth was such a big deal when she became queen. So Catherine of Aragon and King Henry VIII had a daughter, Mary, but Henry wanted to marry again to try and increase his chances of having a boy. And this is when England was a predominantly Catholic country, and they were kind of beholden to the Pope. And the Pope said, no, you married this woman, you have like vowed to marry her, you cannot just divorce her just because she can't give you a son. And Henry decided he didn't really like that, and he chose to divorce Catherine anyway, which was illegal. So he was like, I'm going to denounce Catholicism and make my own church, which is how Protestantism and specifically the Church of England formed. It's a lot more in depth than that. If you're really into history, there's tons of stuff out there. That was just a super, super quick glossary of how that happened. And then when Henry split from the Catholic Church into the Church of England, he married a woman named Anne Boleyn, who, and their marriage resulted in Elizabeth, who became Queen Elizabeth I. And she is the one who is in power during this Renaissance period. After King Henry VIII dies, she eventually gets the throne of England and rules for a very long and successful time. And this Renaissance period was not just in England. England is kind of one of the power players here. But this is a time of rebirth. Renaissance means a rebirth. And it's a rebirth of ideas, of questioning, of discovering things. Art is making a resurgence. Science is making a resurgence. So here is where we see kind of these grand masters of art. So Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and then scientists of Galileo and Copernicus, and then world expansion, specifically like westward expansion, discovering of the New World and such, is also becoming a huge movement of political powers having power in their country and wanting to expand it and increase trade really as quickly and effectively as possible. So you see Columbus, Magellan, and then Martin Luther also comes to power. This is not Martin Luther King. This is a different Martin Luther. He becomes the father of Lutheranism, so a new type of religion as well coming into play with this rebirth of ideas. So there's tons of people talking, tons of people creating things, tons of people writing things and sharing ideas, which kind of leads to this very rich moment of history. England has some of the most progressive views of women. England is really a place where people are thriving as far as like individual freedoms come about. And then we also see this kind of rise in the art of theater. In theater, when you think of Renaissance England, usually becomes fairly synonymous with the works of William Shakespeare. He is a very successful businessman, and he is able to kind of permeate that market. There were other playwrights and other theaters in Shakespearean England, but Shakespeare has kind of risen above the rest and become some of the most widely read works from this time period that is still really highly popular today. The theater in which Shakespeare performed most of his works and premiered most of his works is the Globe. The Globe is a theater that still stands today. It's not in the original location. The first one burned down, and so they rebuilt it and moved it a little bit further away. It's outside of London proper. It was actually illegal to have theater. Theater is one of those things at this time that like was really exciting, but it also kind of had this bad reputation of being immoral, based on this very religious past. Like, gasp, you never know what you might see at the theater. So it was actually built outside on the other side of this river that runs through London called the River Thames. It was built on the other side of the Thames, and after the first one burned, it was moved even a little bit further out than that. You can still visit the Globe Theatre today if you happen to be going to like the London area of England. It's on my bucket list. But the Globe is one of the most famous stages in all of England, and it's where a lot of Shakespeare's work was performed at the time. And it's also where a lot of his work in England is performed nowadays. And you can go see modern adaptations of Shakespearean plays, but you can also go see Shakespeare plays at the Globe that are more traditional in nature, which is kind of cool. The theater itself was very simple. There were no set changes. There was no specialty lighting. I mean, this is before like electricity is a thing. So there's very limited special effects. Sometimes they would have actors or some like small props and stuff lowered down on some kind of pulley system machinery. There might have been some smoke used for things like foggy areas. But that was really the extent of the special effects of the Shakespearean theater. Another pretty famous theater from Shakespearean England, it's a smaller theater, is called the Blackfriars. And this one is different from the Globe. The Globe was an open air theater. So there was kind of this ring of seats around the structure, but there was no actual roof. So you couldn't really perform a play in foul weather. It was only open during the warm months, and you had to go to the theater pretty much at 2:00 in the afternoon for about a 2-hour show before it got too dark to see anything. Blackfriars changed that. Blackfriars used some artificial lighting. Again, no electricity, so they would have been things like torches and sconces, that kind of thing. But Blackfriars was entirely enclosed indoors. So this was kind of the exclusive theater. This was the theater of the wealthy, and it was open year round. So you could go in the winter when you were bored and there was nothing to do. You couldn't really even go outside because there was snow everywhere. You could go watch an indoor play and get that little bit of escape from a theater goer's perspective. And as a business person who's making a profession in the theater, it's also a way for you to make more money. Which kind of brings us to this next slide, all about Shakespeare. Shakespeare grew up just outside of London in a place called Stratford upon Avon. He married Anne Hathaway, not obviously the modern day Anne Hathaway, like the actress, another person named Anne Hathaway, and they had 3 children. Though I'm not sure any one of those children survived. It's actually very sad. He began writing and became a principal writer in an acting company, but he also served multiple roles in that company. He became a playwright, an actor, and he also owned part of the theater. So he's really finding different ways to make money, which allows him to kind of rise above all of the other playwrights of this time. There were a few others, like Christopher Marlowe was another one. Richard Burbage was a pretty hefty theater owner and actor. So there are kind of these other names that crop up in this history of English theater. But Shakespeare kind of had a little bit of a stake in everything. So he was allowed to make more money and he became more successful a little bit faster that way. He earned the nickname the Bard. He is known probably best for creating 39 different plays and 154 sonnets. He also wrote a couple of other kind of epic narrative poetry. Those are not necessarily his most well-known works. Those are some of his earlier works. He is probably best known for his theater. As far as Shakespeare's personal life went, he was a fairly private person. A lot of his, a lot of his personal life is not really well known. It's all what's in the history books is pretty much based on speculation and kind of tying different events and different kind of scraps together. Shakespeare never published a diary or anything like that, telling us all about his personal life. And he also died relatively young. He died at age 52 or possibly 53. Birth records of this time are not very consistent. Birth certificates didn't really exist. Instead, you would have a certificate of baptism, which usually occurred a few days after a child's birth, unless they were really sickly and they didn't think they were going to survive. Then they would try and get someone there pretty much immediately to baptize this child. But otherwise, you would have been a couple days old when you were baptized. So his supposed birthday of April, I want to say it's the 23rd of April was his birthday, is his supposed birth date. It's kind of his celebrated birth date. And that is also the day in which he died 52 years or possibly 53 years later. All right, so there's kind of a lot of mystery surrounding this very famous Englishman. And all of this information is found in your Pearson literature and culture assignment on Pearson Realize. That should be linked on everyone's Google Classroom at this point. This is really just kind of quick recap and overview of that information. That reading will go more in depth even than this will. All right, so if you haven't had a chance to read that yet, go ahead and check that out. One of the things we'd like to establish before jumping into reading some of Shakespeare's works is the difference between comedy and tragedy. These have slightly different connotations than they do nowadays. Comedies, which is not what we're going to be reading for the most part in our Romeo and Juliet unit, has at least one humorous character. Not everyone in a Shakespearean comedy is going to be telling jokes all the time. Not everyone is going to be funny. There will be moments of danger. There will be moments of seriousness. Instead, his comedies tend to have more characters that offer comic relief, but it's usually tied up in just a handful of those characters. The ending of these comedies all tend to look fairly similar. They have a nice kind of wrapped up happy ending. Usually that's a marriage of some sort, whether it's two families being brought together because of this union, or maybe there's a reunion of characters. Lovers who were separated at the beginning of the play are allowed to rejoin each other at the end, that sort of thing. But it's a comedy because it ends on a lighthearted note. I do apologize. There is quite a bit of traffic. Today is one of those lunch pickup and packet pickups for the school that I live like right across the street from, and that traffic is starting to increase. I do apologize for In Shakespearean comedies, the emphasis tends to revolve around the situations characters are in rather than the characters themselves. Yes, there will be character development. There's still storylines that you have to follow. But what makes it really funny is these characters who find themselves in kind of predicaments that they then have to think creatively to get out of, rather than the characters themselves are just so stinking hilarious. Tragedies on kind of the opposition side of Shakespearean writing tend to have a few marked differences. The main character has a moral flaw that usually leads to a downfall. Lots of times this is death. Sometimes it's just a pretty significant maiming or someone close to them dies. Most often in Shakespearean tragedies, the main character will likely die because of some sort of moral flaw. Whether it's pride or envy, or maybe they just are really rash. They don't really think through things. There's something about them that's just kind of short-falling enough that they don't get that happy ending. The emphasis is totally on the characters of the tragedy. We're meant to care for these characters, become invested in how they have been wronged or how they fall into trouble and how they attempt to work out and ultimately their downfall. The Shakespearean tragedy format begins in a very ordered state that descends into chaos as that character falls. And then again, usually the main character has some essence of fate that they cannot escape. And once again, usually that fate is death. We're going to kind of switch gears about halfway through this slideshow. At this point, you won't need to be writing all of this down in your notebook. This, again, is on the slides that are there for quick notice. There might be a few things that you're going to jot a little bit later, but this is more just some of the common ancient language usages versus the modern usage of those terms that we just kind of combed through some Shakespearean text and looked for things that tended to repeat a little bit more often, things that it might be good to try and memorize a little bit sooner, just to kind of get a handle on those. Because once you pick up these patterns, the language of Shakespeare actually becomes pretty easy to follow, and you're not necessarily tripping up over these words because they happen so frequently. So anytime you see a thee or a thou or a thy or a thine, the person who's speaking and saying those words is addressing someone else. So this is the modern version of the second person pronoun of you, right? If I'm saying get thee to a nunnery, I'm saying, hey, you, go to this place where all the nuns live because I can't look at you anymore. All right? We're addressing someone else. The verbs in Shakespearean writing tend to have different endings than what we're used to. The ed ending to show past tense is the same, so that you do not see featured here. But there's also ilt and est tacked onto ends of words. So wilt is the older version of our will. Wilt thou goest, will you go? So goeth and goest both mean goes or go. Doth is the same as does. And art means are. All right, so we have some slightly different verb endings here. Some other swaps from old to new are an in Shakespearean language means if. All right, and this is something that it took me a really long time to kind of work into my memory. I'm just used to seeing an used like an article, and that is something that could be potentially pretty confusing to you. So that's maybe one that I would jot down just so you know, like an is if, an is if, an is if. Wherefore is maybe one of the most misquoted words in Shakespeare. It comes from the play we're going to read, Romeo and Juliet, from the balcony scene, where Juliet's saying, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And people interpret that wherefore as where. That is not the case here. Wherefore, in Shakespeare's language, actually means why. All right, so Juliet isn't asking, where is Romeo? She just saw him leave. She's saying, why are you Romeo? Or why is your name Romeo? which is the name of my family's like ultimate enemy is, right? We could be together and happy if your name was not Romeo, specifically Romeo Montague, but it's not. So she is kind of in this moral quandary of does she follow her heart or does she follow her family expectations? All right, cuz or cousin, you'll see both in Shakespearean text, could literally mean the relation of cousin, or it could just mean a really, really close friend. It's a pretty familiar greeting. So you wouldn't just walk up to anyone on the street and say, hey, cuz. Instead, you would reserve this for someone who you are pretty close with, who you know really well. Sirrah is addressing a man. It could be just addressing a random person that you want to get the attention to. In Shakespearean English, Sirrah could actually be used as an insult. So you just kind of want to look for what else is happening in the scene and what is the context of that particular term. Mistress is a pretty common way to address a woman, specifically a woman who you may not know their specific rank in society, or you maybe don't know their name, but you know that they are important. It's a respectful way to kind of talk to them or address them. Adding a contraction of T is very, very common. Anyone in my class knows that "'tis true" is one of my absolute favorite phrases, and it comes from Shakespeare. So "'tis" in the front of "is" chops that form of "it" and "is" together. It shortens it a little bit. Instead of 2 syllables, you're now only taking 1. So you just kind of brush the T and then go straight for the "is." "'Tis." Same thing if you see an apostrophe T on the end of a word. Usually in Shakespearean English, that apostrophe T is adding it. So "do it" or "do it," where you kind of roll those 2 syllables together, is actually a shortened form of "do it." You could see like "go it" or "go to it" is kind of the same reference there. You'll see a couple of different ways to say yes in Shakespearean English. You might see "I," or you might see "yay." And this "yay" rhymes with "k." It is not the same thing as "yeah." All right. That's not, I guess that's probably not the biggest difference to bring up, but it might throw off some rhyme schemes if you're trying to fit a specific meter. Switching the pronunciation from "yay" to "yeah" could throw off some rhymes that you could catch. Same thing with "no." It's pretty common to see "nay" or "nay." Sometimes there's that E on the end. Spelling was very fluid in Shakespearean English. There's lots of different spellings for lots of different words. So you go more for sound than specific spelling sometimes. So same thing with "nay" with this E on the end of "nay." "Trow" and "methinks" are 2 different ways to kind of be musing to yourself or thinking of something. "Methinks" is the same thing as "I thinks," or "I think," excuse me. "Trow" is more like "I believe." It's a little bit more of a formal declaration of thought, but they both mean generally the same thing. The last 2 kind of substitutions that we're going to talk about are kind of these exclamations that characters may have. Again, these aren't all of them. They're just some of the ones that we saw repeating. So an exclamation of like "awesome" or "cool" or just kind of emphatic joy would be "merry," or sometimes "a faith," which is a contraction of "in faith." Remember, Shakespeare's England is very much religious, whether you are still a Catholic or if you are following the Church of England. You're still likely very reliant on a religious upbringing. So you see those allusions to faith or religion or God, that kind of thing, pretty heavily through Shakespearean text. So "marry a faith" could even be used together. And you're saying like, oh, wow, hold on. Like, we need to talk about this because this is really exciting. "Odds me" or "God of mercy" are both, again, still very religious exclamations, but they tend to be more negative in connotation. They are exclamations of despair or frustration, or you're saying like, oh no, because something has just happened that you can't quite fathom. So you're calling on this kind of religious, like, oh my God, kind of explanation. The next section talks just a little bit about the word order of Shakespearean text, or the syntax of that text. Again, the literature and culture section from Pearson does go a little bit more in depth with this than what these slides do. This is really just a quick overview. So if you haven't read that piece yet, you might want to pause this video, go back and read them, and then come back. Modern English tends to put the subject before the verb, but Elizabethan English tends to put the verb before the subject. Now, sometimes modern English does put the subject before the verb, which I've mimicked here with these bullet points, saying a modern version of like how you ask how someone is, and then how an Elizabethan person might ask that same question. But just kind of note that sometimes the order of the sentence is a little bit off, or it sounds a little bit like Master Yoda is speaking. It still means the same thing as modern English, just the order is a little bit funky sometimes. So a modern person might ask, well, how are you? Or how are you doing? An Elizabethan person to ask the same question could say, how now? Or hold on, good cuz I'm getting your attention by saying like, I'm familiar with you. How farest thou? Or how are you doing? All right, so we just kind of add a little bit of formality to the front. We get the person's attention who we would like to address. We make sure that they are listening, and then we ask them what we want to ask them. And that little slightly more flowery language than maybe what we're used to. As a side note, because we were reading Romeo and Juliet, we want you to expect a fair amount of names stemming from the Italian language or mythology or lore. That's a pretty safe thing to state about a lot of Shakespeare's plays. The Renaissance was a time of revival of art and knowledge, which we've already established, but a lot of this art and knowledge and science and experimentation is stemming from the Italian masters. So we get a lot of those kind of Italian influenced names in Shakespearean writing. We also want to think at this time, published text was not widely available for every person to just go to their local bookshop and buy a book. They were expensive. They were pricey. They were not widely published. If anyone owned a book, it would likely be the Bible, and that might be the only book that they had in their home. Instead, they would have been relying on old myths, old poems, these kind of lasting epics from a more ancient time as their literature of the day if it wasn't a biblical story. So it's not uncommon to see Shakespeare reference things like Greek or Roman gods in his writing. So there might be names that, if you're really into like the Percy Jackson series, you might see those same names kind of cropping up, again, with allusions to those gods or goddesses. So Shakespeare talks about Diana a lot with the moon and the moon symbology with Diana. That kind of thing happens a lot with, women who are considered pure or chaste, kind of lofty in nature. That kind of thing is very common to see in Shakespearean text. All right, we are almost done in this video. I'm sorry, it's a little bit longer. We're kind of throwing a lot at you in this introduction. One of the last things we're going to talk about is the method that Shakespeare used when writing a lot of his works. The most common form of verse was iambic pentameter, or pentameter. Some people stress it a little bit differently. It's the main form of poetic verse of Shakespeare's time. So common, in fact, that it was kind of dubbed blank verse. It's kind of like when you study music and you learn the different time signatures. You learn like 4/4. It's the same as common time. It's the same meaning. It just has a couple of different names that it goes by, that kind of thing. Same thing with verse here. And you want to realize that literacy rates were not the highest in Shakespearean English. People still went to school, but you didn't necessarily stay in school as long as we do nowadays. Instead, you would go through kind of basic education, grammar school, that kind of thing, if you had the funds to attend. And then you would be apprenticed into work. And the same would go for acting companies. So you would be joining a company if you were a young man. Women were not allowed to act in Shakespearean England. So you'd be joining this company and learning these lines pretty much by repetition and hearing it. Maybe you would get to read a side, maybe not. or a side is like just an excerpt of your lines, and then you would practice the order by practicing the text out loud. You wouldn't see the whole script written out like you would lots of times nowadays. So it wasn't uncommon to have lines in verse, because if you knew the style of the verse, then you could kind of predict what would be happening next in that line for your speech. Sometimes it was based on rhyme, sometimes it was based on rhythm, sometimes it's both, like a Shakespearean sonnet is based on both rhyme and rhythm. And so this iambic pentameter style just became very widespread, which is why it kind of has that alternate term of blank verse as well. When you read a work in iambic pentameter, if you're really like highly stressing that rhythm, the stress falls on every other syllable. So the first syllable is unstressed, or it's not very loud, it's not very long, followed by a slightly longer, slightly louder syllable as well. So it kind of sounds like a heartbeat. So an example of a word is Shakespeare. Now, when you say the name Shakespeare, your voice kind of raises an inflection a little bit. It's a little bit louder, it's a little bit longer on the shakes. And then the peer is a little bit softer, and it's a little bit more clipped. So in this example, we have a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. Now, if we use the term forgot, it's the opposite, right? Forgot, that G-O-T on the end of that word is slightly longer. It just has a little bit more stress. You lean into that word just a little bit more. So if I was to use these words in iambic pentameter, I could start a line or start a foot with the word forgot. I could not start one with Shakespeare unless I was breaking the iambic pentameter pattern, which Shakespeare sometimes did. He wasn't absolutely perfect in his meter, but he was pretty consistent. So it would have been kind of a slightly more rare occurrence. If we have some basic definitions, this is maybe what I would write in your notebook, just so you have it kind of readily available as you do some other work for what makes the term iambic pentameter. We have the vocab word iamb, and we have the word pentameter or pentameter. One iamb is one lyrical foot, or if you're talking about verse, you tend to talk in feet if you're doing analysis of that work. And so one iamb, that style, contains two syllables always, and one syllable is unstressed, one syllable is stressed in that order. Pentameter just means how many iambs do you have. So penta, right, the prefix there means 5. So we know we have meter based on 5 iambs per feet, or one line of text in iambic pentameter will be 10 syllables total. So you can divide that 10 into 5 little sets of 2. All right. So when you read it aloud, in especially highly stylized ways, when you go watch a Shakespearean play, you don't necessarily stress this. Like, the actors don't talk just in iambic pentameter. They do talk like normal people. So sometimes it's easier to catch this than others. There are some productions that stress the meter, but not very many do for modern audiences. All right, but when you're analyzing, you just kind of want to listen for that da-dum, 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 da-dum. If you're struggling, you probably want to read it out loud and just kind of listen to where are you stressing. You might use like a voice record app and record yourself reading and then listen back to where are you stressing it. If you have a dance background and you know a little bit of tap dance, the same iamb would sound like a flap, which is what this actor, Kenneth Branagh, is going to demonstrate for us from an excerpt from the movie Love's Labour's Lost. This is an adaptation of a Shakespeare's play, Love, Labour's Lost. They've updated it and added some music to it. And he uses this scene to tap dance a little bit of iambic pentameter. All right, I'm going to try playing it. Actually, I don't think it will pick up. So just when you're watching this video, pause it and take time to actually watch this clip. It's only about a minute for the full example. You can likely pick up what he's demonstrating within the first 30 to 40 seconds. And then the very last thing we're going to talk about, kind of stemming from this style of sonnet, is the Shakespearean sonnet. There are always 14 lines, always, and you can chop those lines into some slightly smaller sets. So the first set of 4 follows an ABAB structure, or lines 1 and 3 will rhyme, lines 2 and 4 will rhyme, and then those rhymes will not repeat again for the rest of the sonnet. It won't always be chunked in an individual stanza of 4. Lots of sonnets are written just as one straight stanza of 14 lines, but you can kind of break those that larger stanza down into smaller chunks. And so this first line, or this first set of 4 lines, will also likely have one set of meaning. I think a lot of students struggle when reading Shakespeare or when studying Shakespeare because they try and translate word to word, or old language to kind of modern English, or individual lines. And for the most part, I do not suggest doing that. Look for chunks of text, because the meaning is going to kind of repeat in those smaller chunks. If you know a sonnet is made up of 3 sets of 4 plus 2, then you have kind of 4 mini movements, so 4 main ideas of a poem that are all going to build together. The same is going to be true when you start reading or watching his plays. Listen to chunks of text from characters, and if a character is not saying much, think about why aren't they saying anything. Maybe they're struggling to say something, or maybe they're just simply not important to the main idea of the scene. I really think it becomes really frustrating to try and translate individual words to understand what Shakespeare is trying to say, because the language is a little bit older, and it just takes too long. You lose the meaning, and it's really not very enjoyable when you do it. So a sonnet will have kind of 4 main ideas. One chunk of 4 following a rhyme. And then when you notice the rhyme changing, you know that the main meaning is going to slightly change as well. So then the second chunk of 4, third chunk of 4, and then the final 2 lines are where the pattern kind of breaks in a sonnet. These are the only 2 lines that will rhyme back to back. And these final 2 lines of a Shakespearean sonnet tend to have kind of like a conclusion, final idea feel to them. So we have a couple of examples pulled for you. The first one that we're going to pull is Sonnet 18. It's one of Shakespeare's most famous sonnets. If you just Google Shakespearean sonnets, this will likely be one of the first ones to pop up. I think it's because the meaning here is fairly accessible. It follows all of the sonnet rules, so it's a really good one to use in teaching. And then it doesn't get too crazy in its meaning. So we have first 4 lines. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Now, if I was reading this stressing the meter, I would say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Some people stress it a lot when they read or perform Shakespeare. Others don't. I tend to not stress it. Sometimes it kind of naturally comes out as kind of this bouncy rhythm. But it's not something that I normally pay the closest attention to. I tend to read more through punctuation to try and crop ideas together that go together. So we have, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. And so we have this day and May rhyme, temperate and date rhyme. Now, in modern English, it sounds more like a slant rhyme. Temperate and date don't really sound like they rhyme. They look like they do, but they don't sound like it. In Shakespeare's pronunciation, you would likely have voiced this ATE as 8. So thou art more lovely and more temperate. Perhaps that might be a little bit too stressed for this example, but it would be a little bit more of a truer rhyme there than a total slant rhyme nowadays, just as language has kind of updated and how we pronounce things has updated. So we have in this first 4 lines, this person penning this sonnet, can I compare you to summer? Could I please do that for you? So it sounds very complimentary at first, but then they come right back and say, you're even more lovely than a summer's day. You're even calmer than a summer's day, because summer can be really rough and windy, and it can kind of destroy this natural beauty, like these little buds that are just kind of hanging on trees in like early summer, or really like what we'd probably call like spring, if we're talking May here. If it's too windy, those will fall to the ground and then their beauty is lost. And summer's actually not going to last forever. Like those perfect summer days are fairly fleeting. And we know that immediately after summer becomes that kind of autumn and winter and kind of time of death type thing. So he's asking permission. Can I compare you? Because I'm going to show you like how much better than summer you are. Right, so this is a very kind of flattering introduction to the subject of this sonnet. Next 4 lines where we have that new rhyme scheme. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often it says gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. And so here we're focusing a little bit more. We've asked the question, can we compare? And this next chunk of 4 shifts the focus more onto the subject of the summer's day. And so he's giving us examples of how summer isn't that awesome, right? The eye of heaven is likely the sun. We're talking about how hot it is. The next line talks about the gold complexion and how the gold complexion of the sun can be dimmed by things like summer storms, or maybe it's just cloudy and rainy, kind of like today. So we have these moments where it should be really nice and calm and breezy, but for nature's reason, it's not. And nature can be fairly swift in its change, of course, and it can be very sudden, but we also know that it follows general patterns as well. All right, so kind of the suddenness there, that by chance, and then we know that, you know, nature works in cycles with summer, fall, winter, back to spring, that kind of thing, for the changing course there. Now, the next 4 lines is where we usually see the Shakespearean turn, where the idea is going to change even more than the first 8 lines. So lines 1 through 8 kind of have the same ideas, and then these next set of 4, so starting that, but thy eternal to when in eternal is likely going to have a slightly different emphasis than the first 8 lines. So we're talking about summer's not that great, but you are better. And then we're going to see that shift again in these next 4 lines. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So we have this shift here, where before the poet has been focusing more on the natural side of things and kind of finding the flaws of the natural world. Now we're shifting more to this person and how this person is going to be their constant or their eternal, and that for whatever reason, this person will never lose their beauty. That fair could simply be talking about like physical beauty, or it could be talking about this personality that links this poet to this person. Shakespeare didn't always write his sonnets for himself. Sometimes he penned them for other people. So we can't know for sure if this is Shakespeare talking to a love interest or not. But we do know that the perspective of the poem, or the speaker of the poem, is very caring towards this person. And for whatever reason, this person is never going to fade in the eyes of this speaker. So much so that like death cannot claim them. Now, they probably don't mean like literally this person is not going to die, like they're not an immortal, but for some reason, really only known to the speaker of this poem, this subject matter of Sonnet 18 is going to live forever, right? When in eternal lines to time thou growest, or you will grow into eternity. Now, that could be like saying like your memory will never be forgotten, or it could be something a little bit more specific, and that meaning is a little bit lost in these 4 lines. So we're going to read that final couplet, or that final set of 2, to kind of see, does that clarify things? And again, these final set of 2 are where we're going to see rhymes back to back. It's the only time of the poem that we'll see those 2 things match. So when in eternal lines to time thou growest, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And there is the final sentiment of Sonnet 18. It's so beautiful. This speaker is saying, so long as men can breathe. Now, this isn't talking about like physical men, it's talking about like mankind, or like so long as people are on the planet and they are breathing and they are seeing, so long lives this. And this is where like in modern writing nowadays we kind of avoid the word this or it because they're like vague pronouns. We don't know exactly what it is, but in the context of this poem, this is the poem itself. So as long as people are alive and they can see, they can read this poem, and this poem is what will give you that everlasting life. Now, this poem doesn't give us a specific name or specific like description of like what their face looks like or what their body looks like, even who they are. But we know that this person is very closely tied to this speaker, and they care a lot about them, and that they are a fair person, and that they are cared for. So this love and this care is going to live on so long as this poem can be studied. And that's what they likely meant in when in eternal lines to time thou growest, and nor shall death brag thou wanderest in the shade, because this poem still exists and it's still being taught and read today. So we still know that this relationship existed at some point in time. All right. You are going to get a second poem now. That's going to be your homework. Sonnet 130. It's a poem that I really like. Some people don't really like it, but I like it because it seems a little bit more sarcastic to me, and I really enjoy sarcasm. It's a little bit like a backhanded compliment. This is one that Shakespeare scholars believe Shakespeare wrote about his wife, and they didn't always have the best relationship. So it kind of has a funny aspect to it. And there's a graphic organizer here that is linked on Classroom at this point, where we want you to first read through the following sonnet, and then we would like you to bold the stressed syllables, kind of practicing that iambic pentameter. Does the whole thing fit a true iambic pentameter structure, or do you notice any differences in the verse? We'd like you to highlight and label the rhyme scheme, that A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D type stuff, and does it fit all of those kind of rhyme rules that a Shakespearean sonnet is supposed to? And then your challenge here is to just work through the poem and write a short summary of what you think Shakespeare's trying to say, or interpret the meaning of this sonnet. Again, please do not try and translate line by line into a modern telling of this sonnet. Instead, go by chunks. Remember that a Shakespearean sonnet tends to have meanings in lines 1 through 4, and then 5 through 8, and then 9 through 12, and then kind of a conclusion in 13, 14. All right. When you start line 9, you might see that Shakespearean turn, or that change in idea, but try and move chunk by chunk. If you think you're getting it pretty easily in sets of 4, then you could maybe go in sets of 2 by line. But if you go by sets of 4, you'll likely get the bigger ideas and not really miss anything. And it'll be a little bit more approachable. I posted this example to your Padlet last week when we were writing our own poems and taking pictures that kind of captured that inspiration. So this is my work, but I tried to write a Shakespearean style poem. I had Shakespeare in the brain because I knew this was upcoming. And so this is what I wrote, with an example of how I found the rhythm of the iambic pentameter, and then I both highlighted my rhymes and then I labeled my rhyme scheme. Okay. So that is kind of an example to help with your own analysis of Sonnet 130. All right. We do suggest that you have this done by Wednesday of this week before your 9 o'clock meeting, so that way you're nice and prepared for that meeting. If you have questions, please send Ms. Decker or myself an email. or just bring them to the meeting on Wednesday. Wednesday, we're going to get into the text of Romeo and Juliet. We did this intro language study and sonnet study, so that way you had some exposure to the language before you had to start kind of piecing it together over a course of time to make sense of a larger chunk of text when Shakespeare can be pretty new to most of you guys. So again, don't hesitate to ask questions. Enjoy the work. Come with questions on Wednesday, and we're going to get into the text. See you then.